Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the MotorCity mechanic. In today's video, we're going to be dealing with a 2007 Dodge Ram 3500. And this has the first generation 6.7 liter Cummins diesel engine. And what we're going to be doing is removing and replacing the thermostat. For this particular truck, we've got a P0128 thermostat stuck open. It's not a very common issue on these trucks, but nonetheless, I want to show you how to remove and replace it. Now, when it comes to the 6.7 liter Cummins engine, thermostats are not a common item that you're going to be replacing, but from time to time you're going to have to. This particular vehicle has 260,000 miles, and we've got both a check engine light for a stuck open thermostat, and if you look at the scanner readings as well as the dash readings for temp, you'll see that we never reached a halfway mark. We're around a quarter, so she's never warming up properly. So at that point, the thermostat most likely is stuck open and allowing the coolant to go through instead of warming up inside the engine first and then opening up. Now, this is a first gen 6.7 liter, meaning that we've got a radiator cap on the radiator. We don't have the pressure tank on the firewall, and we do have an overflow bottle here. And we actually have a bleeder port located right up here by the EGR cooler. Later models don't. Now, there's a different procedure for bleeding both of those when it comes to getting air out of the coolant system. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind throughout this video is there's going to be some of those while we're in there moments that could apply to your vehicle, and it's got to do with what kind of maintenance you've done. Being that this is an early model or first gen 6.7, when you hit 67,500 miles and every increment of that afterwards, you've got to clean the EGR cooler. It's good to recommend to clean the EGR crossover pipe, the EGR valve, and replace the crankcase filter. Later models, you don't have to do all that. You're just doing the crankcase filter. But we're going to be removing some of those components throughout this procedure, so it will be the perfect time for you to knock out a 67.5 service. Other thing is, we're removing coolant, either all of it or some of it. And depending on that, at this point, it would actually be perfect for you to replace radiator hoses or antifreeze at the same time. So again, keep that in mind. You can knock out a couple different birds with one stone while you're in here, while you've got things torn apart. But for now, we're just going to be sticking to the thermostat. Now, the thermostat on the 6.7 liter is where the upper radiator hose attaches to the engine. Now, in order to get to it, we've got to get a few things out of the way because it's kind of tucked up under there and some of the fasteners aren't easy to get to. Otherwise, its location isn't bad. They just put some different things in front of it so that you couldn't get directly to it. Now, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to remove this plastic decorative shield that's on top of the engine. And the first thing you do on that is remove your oil dipstick. Now, that plastic cover has a total of 4 8mm fasteners. Now, with that out of the way, we've got a little better access to seeing what we're going to be working on. This housing right here, you can see where the upper radiator hose is attached. Actually, it has the exhaust pressure sensor and the tube going to it mounted on it. Now, in order to get to the fasteners and the heat shield for the housing, the EGR cooler and EGR valve crossover pipe has to be removed. Now, we've got two clamps, one on both ends, and we've got what we call a P clamp that's in the middle right here that kind of helps support it. We've got to get that off first before we can actually get to the fasteners for the housing. Now, both of the clamps have an 11mm nut on this long threaded shaft. Now, I want you to pay attention on how it's positioned, because if you don't reinstall it correctly, then when you go to put the plastic cover on top, the stud could hit it. So in this case, we've got it angled a little bit so it's kind of down low, and pay attention to the other side as well. All you're going to need is a deep 11mm socket. You don't have to take it all the way off. You just want to get enough to where you can break it loose, rotate it around, and separate the clamp. We'll repeat the same thing on the opposite side where the EGR valve is. Again, paying attention to how we've got the clamp position next to the EGR valve. This one's basically horizontal. Get up in there for 11mm. rotate it around, remove it from the clamp right there, we can spread it apart. Now in a perfect world where mechanics haven't touched vehicles previously, we'd have a fastener right here. It'd be an 8mm, and that's what's holding what we call the P-clamp to the bracket that's on the front of the engine. That kind of helps supports that crossover pipe. Now, at some point in the past, I've worked on this, I've done different things. This is my personal vehicle. I have either left it off or left it loose and it fell off. But nonetheless, it'd be right here, and I'll show you once we get it off what I'm talking about. Now, being that it's not there, we should be able to grab this. If we need to, we can probably just tap on it with our fist and break it loose. We can just work it out. Now with that crossover pipe off, I want to point out some important details. Now we've got gaskets on both ends, and they are different. The one over here that goes towards the cooler is a flat metal style, versus the one that goes up against the EGR valve is cone shaped and made out of a composite type material. Now here is that P-clamp. You can't really see it too well because it's covered up by this insulated wrap, but that's where that 8mm fastener should be. Goes through here. Let me show you on the block where it actually threads into. Now this right here is that bracket. That's what the bolt should be threading into if you have a bolt. And as you can see, we've got some harnesses that actually snap onto it as well. So I will make sure I find a fastener going back so that way it's reinstalled properly. Again, that P-clamp is basically to help support the pipe, and then obviously we've got the clamps on both ends. Now with that off, we can actually jump over to the thermostat housing and go ahead and move the heat shield. Now this heat shield is attached with two 8mm bolts here and there. Now we've got to remove that to get to some of the fasteners once we get to the point that we need to remove this upper thermostat housing. If you look real close right here, you can actually see that flat metal gasket I was telling you about that goes between the crossover pipe and going towards the cooler. Again, we're not going to need that. So let's go ahead and take these fasteners off. We can set that heat shield off to the side. Now, reading the comments in previous videos, one thing that stands out the most that people seem to be struggling with is how to disconnect certain connectors from certain sensors. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this one for a quick second so that you don't have any problems. Now, the connector for this exhaust pressure sensor has what I call a two-stage lock. The red piece right here is the primary lock, so we've got to slide that. That lock is preventing us from squeezing in on secondary. So nonetheless, that's got to be moved over. Now this one is oriented this way. Yours may be in a different rotation location, but still, nonetheless, the red or primary lock has to be slid over till it's flush on one side. Now, in a perfect world, we'd be able to push this with our finger, but more than likely there's dust, dirt built up in there, and you may not be able to. If so, you can use a flat tip screwdriver or any other tool to get in there. Another thing that kind of helps is to hit it with a little bit of WD-40. Kind of cleans out all the dust, dirt, and lubes it up. Again, you can try pushing it with your finger. In this case, I can. So we've got it flush on this side and it's protruding more over here. Primary lock's disengaged. Secondary lock, we're just going to squeeze and lift up. There you have it. Again, here you can see a little close-up of that mechanism. Primary lock. This would be it locked in place. You're not allowed to squeeze that and lift up. You've got to move it over. So pay attention to that, and you'll probably be able to use this technique on other connectors as well. So if the connector removed, let's go ahead and move over to the tube that goes to the exhaust pressure sensor that comes off the manifold. I'm just going to disconnect a little plastic clip there for the harness. I'm going to grab a line wrench. This happens to be a 12mm. I don't want to round it off and break it loose. And we're not too worried about pulling the tube all the way out right now. Once we get the bolts loose on the thermostat housing, we'll probably have some wiggle room. But if you need, back here, there is a bracket that comes off of this that goes down to one of the exhaust manifold studs. Typically, they're about 15mm, and that's if you have one. A lot of them don't for some reason. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and back this all the way off. So now that we've removed everything that's either covering or actually fastened to that thermostat housing, we're ready to deal with the coolant system. So the first thing we need to do is we need to lower the antifreeze at least to a level that's below the thermostat housing or completely drain it. Again, this is the perfect time if you haven't replaced your antifreeze in a long time to go ahead and drain it all and go back with fresh. In this case, I've replaced this radiator about 3 months ago, so the antifreeze in it is fairly new. I'm actually going to be reusing some of that, so I'm going to capture what I have and then top it off if I need some fresh. Again, it's just based off your mileage and what kind of service that you've been doing to the vehicle. But for now, let's go ahead and I'll talk about where the radiator drain is so you can drain some of that coolant, if not all of it, out. Now, before we go draining the antifreeze out of the radiator, I want to give you an important warning, and that is do not open the radiator cap or the drain while the engine's hot. I know that's common sense, but again, some people forget or some people don't know any better. Do not under any circumstances do that because you could get burnt or scalded. Make sure that the coolant is cold before you open up the cap or this drain valve. So I've got my bucket up under here, and as you can see, this white valve here, that's not normal. This is an aftermarket radiator that was again replaced 3 months ago. I'll show you what the OEM one looks like and also some important tips when you go to loosen that one up so you don't cause any damage. But for now, I'm just going to back this one off. Just let it pour into my bucket. And this is the radiator that actually came out of that truck. As you can see, we don't have the white aftermarket style drain. This is the OEM one. This is what it looks like when it's out of the radiator. Pay attention to that O-ring right there. That's real important. That's what this tip is about. Now, in the lifespan of a vehicle, this may be opened up once, twice, or better yet, never. And what happens is that O-ring is dry and so is the bore. And sometimes when you back this off, it isn't just opening, it's actually kind of corkscrewing up. And when it does, it damages the O-ring or it distorts it. So when you go to tighten it back down, now you've got a new leak. So you've got your original problem and now you created a new problem. So there's a tip for this. And what I recommend doing is, we need to lube it up. So in this case, we're gonna get some WD-40. I want you to spray up inside the drain. And as you spray up in there, it's gonna coat the passage and you'll see it come out around the perimeter of that valve. So now it's lubed, we can grab our tool, and as we back off, you'll see how it kind of corkscrews up. There you go. And it should stop. Depending on the age of the vehicle and the plastic, if it keeps turning, then the blocks in here are broke. At that point, you're getting a radiator anyway. But again, that's to lube it up so that we don't damage the O-ring. Same thing, we're going back down. It's well lubricated. It'll lock into place. Important note, if you haven't ever touched this or it hasn't been done in a long time. At this point, we're ready to unbolt that thermostat housing and lift it up. Now I'm going to leave the upper radiator hose attached. I'm not replacing this hose. If you've got over 100,000 miles, probably the perfect time to do it while we don't have antifreeze in the system. But again, it's going to allow me to pick it up and do what I need to because the hose is flexible and it's pretty long, so I don't have to necessarily take it off, but you can if you want. We've got 3 8mm bolts around the perimeter. Now I'm just going to use a magnet to reach down in there to grab them so I don't lose them. At this point, there's nothing else stopping us from removing it. So I'm going to grab the neck right here where the radiator hose is on, break it loose, and pick it up, move it out of the way. Now I like to use these 90-degree needle nose pliers, so that way I can grab up on it and pick it up. Now if you look real close to the perimeter up here, there should be some rubber around the inside. You can actually see a piece that's still there. The rest of it's gone. Bottom side, same thing. We can see a strip there and a strip there. It should be all the way around the perimeter. It's the main reason why we're replacing it, because we were getting some codes for a thermostat being stuck open. And also our coolant temp would only go up to about 1/4. It would never go halfway. Summer's not a problem. Winter, we didn't get much heat inside the truck. Now before we go installing the new thermostat, we need to kind of clean up the surface. Now again, the O-ring, if you look real close, this sits inside of a groove, so really cleaning the top surface here really doesn't do a lot, but we're still going to kind of scuff it up and get it nice and clean, and we'll try to get the edge. I love using these little things right here. They almost look like a glorified Brillo pad. You can buy these at your local building supply store, Home Depot, Lowe's. They come in different packs. These are nice and flexible. It kind of gets down in all the grooves and all the crevices. I'll try to clean it up with a little bit of elbow grease and get down in that groove. And then come back, clean up maybe a little bit of brake clean. And then another thing we'll do is we'll actually make sure we blow out all the passages in case any antifreeze got into those holes that the 8mm bolts went in. We'll blow them out and again make sure we clean up that surface. And then we'll kind of do the same thing on the thermostat housing. We'll make sure that's nice and clean right there. This is flat, doesn't have the recessed groove like it does on the block down here, or the head, excuse me. So we'll just clean this outer surface here. You can do it the same way, or if you got one of those roll lock pads, we'll probably use one of those on this, being that it's not aluminum. We'll just take care in our cleaning. Now when it comes to installing the thermostat, the only thing you got to pay attention to is to make sure you install it like this. The larger side faces down. If this has been a Hemi or something like that, these jiggle valves you'd want to put up, or any other vehicle where it's kind of mounted sideways, we put them at the highest point. In this case, we don't need to. We just sit it down in there and make sure it sits flush inside the groove. At this point, we're ready to go ahead and reinstall the upper thermostat housing. Again, you don't have to have the upper hose attached. I already did because I didn't take it loose to begin with. I'm just going to position it down in there. Look down as we're guiding it straight. That way we don't move that thermostat. Let it sit on the head. And at that point, if you need to manipulate that exhaust pressure tube, so be it. We still got the little wiggle room. And we'll go ahead and grab our 8mm bolts and start sitting them down in the hole. And this is the point where I'm going to recommend you hand start these 8mm. No use in using any kind of impact or cordless tool. Just run them down, and then we're actually going to give you some torque specs. So for those who want specs and they use torque wrenches, I got you covered. Now the spec for those 3 8mm thermostat housing bolts is 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds, and I want to stress that because foot-pounds and inch-pounds are completely different things. If you use one, you're going to break bolts. And I have to say that time and time again because people still to this day will not listen to that. 89 inch-pounds, and we're going to use that spec on a few other things as well, so you're going to hear me say it repeatedly. 89 inch-pounds, just go around the perimeter. Now if you remember, that heat shield's attached with 2 8mm bolts. They're real short. Now being that the shield has a little cutout, so you could actually hand start these. Get them in there so you're not trying to fight with lining up the heat shield. Get it in there, sit it down on there, and kind of rotate it in place. And again, we'll snug them down by hand. And these have a spec as well. Now the torque for the bolts for the heat shield are 79 inch-pounds. 79 inch-pounds. So at this point, we're ready to deal with everything related to the exhaust pressure sensor. On that connector, all we want to do is slide down until we hear the click, and then we're going to slide that primary lock back over. Here we go, and you should be able to reach in there. If not, get your screwdriver again and move it till it's actually flush on this side and protruding on the opposite side now. And then we're going to deal with the exhaust pressure tube. The main thing to worry about when actually reinstalling that pressure tube is to make sure you don't cross thread the fitting. And wouldn't you know it, there's a spec on that fitting for the exhaust pressure tube as well. That's 88 inch-pounds. So we had 89 on the thermostat housing bolts, but 88. For some reason, 1 inch-pound difference. Who knows? But whatever reason, the engineer says that one has to be 88. So be it. Got my crow's foot, got my torque wrench. I want to make sure it's at 88. So now we're down to just a few more items. We've got the crossover suit to put back on, that plastic decorative shield, dipstick, and then we deal with the coolant system, right? We're going to be adding coolant and bleeding it out as well to get the air out. So we're going to be dealing with the crossover pipe next. Again, I need to find a fastener for that P-strap or P-clamp. And we're going to deal with cleaning the surfaces, both right here where the tube mates up and also back over here at the EGR valve where that cone-shaped gasket is. Now on this side, we don't have to do too much cleaning because that gasket being metal, there's no composite on it. There's nothing that's really going to stick there. But again, we want to get a nice clean surface. And again, these work perfectly for that. Get a little bit of abrasiveness, but not enough to actually damage anything. Now on the EGR valve side of things, the gasket is still stuck there. It didn't stay on the tube, it stayed on the EGR valve. So we got to get something to kind of pry it off. Now, unlike that flat metal one, this one is composite. So there's going to be a buildup of material that we do have to clean off. It's going to take a little bit more effort. So just take your time, go around the perimeter here, and it'll eventually come off. Now we're just going to repeat it over here on the pipe itself. And like I said, I like to use this, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll take the roll lock pad off of the die grinder and I'll just use that as well, depending on what I have. Remember, this side's going to be a little bit harder because that's where that cone-shaped gasket was. This will fit down in there pretty good. So these are the gaskets that we're going to need. That flat metal one goes over here, cooler side, cone shape again, EGR valve. Part number for the flat one, if you're going Mopar, is 68027035 Alpha Bravo. Average price $10-12 bucks. They do make them in the aftermarket world too. It's just a matter of if you can find them. Then we got the cone shaped one, composite again. That part number is 68005465 Alpha. Average price about $8. This one just sits in the groove, so you gotta keep an eye on it so it doesn't fall out. This one right here, we gotta kind of put it on there because it's not a perfect hole. It's got these little flat edges here, so we'll get one side on. We might have to use a little pocket screwdriver to get the other side down and then kind of bend it flat again. It doesn't just sit on there like it's supposed to without a little bit of effort. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Go ahead and try to get it on now while we're talking. Might have to tweak it. There we go. That one actually didn't go on too bad. We kind of lucked out. Sometimes you gotta flex it a little bit, or like I said, use that pocket screwdriver. So this one should stay in place without having any problems. Keep an eye on it. Again, this is the one that's going to want to keep falling off on you. So once you get it up on there, we'll worry about the clamps, and then we'll come back and we'll worry about that P-strap. So now everything's cleaned. I've got my clamps in the right positions as far as orientation the way I want them. I've got my little missing 8mm fastener, which really is probably the hardest part of the entire job, is trying to get up in there to line it up. Taking it off is one thing, going back on is another, because you do have a clamp that has to be squeezed. I'm going to wait on installing that flat metal gasket for now. So we're just going to position it down in here, get it where it needs to be and get it real close. And as you can see, we're right up against the EGR valve. We're good there. Now we'll grab this. So now I grab that flat metal washer, sit right there on the lip, and put it up against and make sure it's seated. So I'll go ahead and grab my first clamp, slide it around, squeeze it with my hand, and then kind of install the shaft onto the other side. Now what I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to snug it down. I'm not torquing it down with my cordless tool. I'm just kind of snugging it down so I don't have so much play. I'm wiggling it as I go so I can make sure it's still loose, yet it's still holding the pipe. That's pretty good right there. And again, remember, orientation is real important here. You don't want to go too far because as you tighten down, you're going to hit that shield. But again, we've got a cover going on, so we got to get it in the right sweet spot, like right about there. Now we'll jump over to the other clamp. And the same procedure for this clamp. We'll spread it apart, slide it around, put the shaft back through the other side. What we'll do is we'll snug it up, but not tighten it. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of moving it as I go, and once I start feeling it, getting some kind of resistance, I'll stop. That should be good right there, because there's a spec on these, and I'm about to give it to you. Now before we torque down those clamps, we need to go ahead and get that 8mm P-strap, P-bracket, whatever you want to call it, that fastener on. So let's go ahead and get that knocked out. Again, this is probably the hardest part, trying to line it up and get to it. Now remember, you don't have to take the upper radiator hose off the housing. Now it helps when you're fighting with this 8mm, but again, you don't have to because the hose flexes. You can get your socket down in there. So it's not a do or die thing. Yes, it would make it a little bit easier if you took the hose off, but you can still get away with it there. Now the torque on that 8mm P-strap bolt, yeah, it's going to be 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds. Now the torque spec for both of the clamps, you guessed it, 89 inch-pounds. As you can see, we've been using that spec for a lot of things today. All right, we got that one. We'll jump over to this one. So now we're ready for that plastic cover. I'm not going to give you a spec on these. I feel it's kind of not necessary. It really doesn't serve any kind of function other than cosmetically, just for appearance. Just going to snug them down. Now we're just going to insert the old dipstick. So now we're down to pretty much the last step, and that's going to be adding coolant back into the cooling system. First thing, make sure you didn't forget to shut the radiator drain. Next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing this bleeder port. Luckily on this first gen 6.7, we've got a bleeder port we can remove. Once you remove it, we're going to clean it, put some liquid Teflon on so it's ready to go and be ready to be resealed once we install it. We're going to add antifreeze to the radiator. We got our 50-50 mix ready to go, and once we start seeing antifreeze coming out this bleeder port, we'll cap it off. Then we'll make sure that the radiator is completely full, close it off with a new radiator cap, and at that point we can clear the codes and let it run. Now the port has a recessed Allen head on it. Now my truck shows to be a quarter. Sometimes you'll find a different size on different trucks. Nonetheless, this is a quarter. Yours may be slightly different. Now liquid Teflon is your friend. We use it in a lot of different cooling system items as far as fittings, or in this case, this block-off plug, right? You use it in some of the oil systems as far as oil pressure sensors. Some come with thread sealant already on it. Again, you may have to add it, or if you've removed something, you're going to be adding more. It comes in a tape, comes in liquid. I prefer the liquid. The tape, you got to remember which orientation you're supposed to put it on. Not that I'm stupid or nothing, but the liquid to me also seems to go in all the crevices better. And the reason why I'm doing it now is once I add the antifreeze and the antifreeze comes out, I'm ready for this. I'm not going to stop, then clean it, and then add Teflon. Let's go ahead and get it ready to go. So now we're ready to go ahead and start adding antifreeze to the system. Now this right here is one of those coolant funnel kits you can get. This is like Harbor Freight, $32 including tax. This is pretty good because you can get the fluid level real high so it can get out that bleeder pretty easy. And again, on this first gen 6.7, we're going through the radiator. Later models, you're dealing with a pressure tank or bottle that's up against a firewall. And that bleeding procedure is a lot different. This one, again, we're just going to start adding until we see it come out the bleeder. And then we'll keep an eye on the vent right here. And as we're pouring it in, once it starts coming through, we'll put our plug that's got that Teflon sealant on there back into the hole. We'll keep adding a little bit more where it stays at a certain level. Right now we're getting the air out. There we go. We're good to go. Now if that bleeder cap installed, all we got to do now is make sure we top off the radiator, install our cap, and make sure that the coolant bottle is at the full mark as well. So hopefully after watching this video, you now know everything when it comes to removing and replacing that thermostat. It's not hard to get to, but there are a few different components that are in your way that you've got to remove. All in all, it probably takes about 30 minutes max. And in that case, you can save you some money by doing it yourself. Again, remember, if you've got to do a 6.7.5 coming up, or you're almost about due, knock it out at the same time if it's a first gen. Also, if you want to do your hoses, coolant at the same time, perfect opportunity. So if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. If you got any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in today's video, leave something in the comments below. Also, if you like to shop on Amazon, which everybody does, scroll down into the description. There is a generic Amazon link. If you click on that and make that your Amazon homepage, anything that you buy will help support this channel. Once again, everybody, thanks for watching.